The dust in the old house tasted like forgotten time. It coated everything: the warped floorboards, the skeletal remains of a clawfoot tub, the air itself. Every breath I took felt heavy, weighted with nearly a century of neglect. I had just closed the deal on this place, 1428 Ash Street, for a price that seemed absurdly low, even for a wreck this complete. It wasn't a bargain, my cousin Mark had insisted. It was a liability. Mark, bless his practical heart, saw the chipped paint, the sagging porch, the broken windows that stared out like vacant, dead eyes. He saw demolition costs and tetanus shots. He saw what everyone else in the small, forgotten corner of Vermont saw: a crumbling monument to bad decisions and local ghost stories. Seriously, Luke? Mark's laugh was harsh and dismissive, echoing too loudly in the hollow space of the living room, the only space that wasn't completely choked with debris. He was leaning against a doorframe that looked like a stiff wind could turn it to splinters, his arms crossed over his chest, radiating superior judgment. What are you even going to do with this? Set it on fire for the insurance money? Because that's about the only sensible option left. The foundation is shot, the roof is a joke, and, oh yeah, remember Mrs. Hemlock said her grandfather saw a whole coven meeting in the attic back in the 60s? He rolled his eyes, a gesture so profoundly Mark. I didn't react to the dig, or the coven comment, or even the subtle insult hidden in the question about my sanity. I just kept my eyes on a specific section of the wall where the plaster was bubbling and peeling away, revealing the dark, thick laths beneath. I had expected this reaction. Anyone looking at the house's facade would have the same thought. It was the quintessential abandoned house, the kind of place teenagers dare each other to visit at midnight. For the past 2 months, everyone had been advising me to walk away. The bank refused a standard mortgage, demanding I take out a specialized structural renovation loan, which was essentially a polite way of saying they knew I was buying a very expensive pile of firewood. "It's structurally sound enough for the first phase," I said quietly, brushing dust off the edge of a plastic-covered folder I was holding. My voice sounded calm, deceptively so, and the contrast seemed to irritate Mark more than if I had argued. He wanted a fight, a chance to lecture me about the unforgivable sin of sentimental real estate investment. "Structurally sound," he mocked, pushing off the doorframe. "Luke, I could punch this wall and my fist would go through to the kitchen. Look at it. This place has been vacant for 40 years, longer if you count the 10 years the last owner was in a nursing home and just paid the taxes. It's a liability, a curse, maybe even legitimately haunted. I hear the old owner, Elias Thorne, used to keep something locked up in the basement no one ever saw. It's got a history, sure, but the kind of history that subtracts value, not adds it." He walked closer, his boots crunching over splintered glass near the hearth. "What? Did you find some buried treasure maps? You're pouring your savings into this hole, and you're acting like you know something I don't. Spill it. What's the big secret? Are you secretly planning to sell it to Hollywood for a horror movie set?" The light filtering through the grimy window caught the cover of the folder I was holding, illuminating the faint, elegant script of the title page. This was the moment. I had been waiting for the exact inflection of smug skepticism in his voice, the moment he completely dismissed the entire project. It was the perfect setup. I turned slowly, facing him fully, and a genuine, slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a triumphant smile, not yet, but a deeply satisfied one. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you hold the ace in a game everyone else thinks they've already won. I opened the folder, not abruptly, but with the careful reverence that old, brittle paper demands. I pulled out the main document, a large, yellowed page covered in precise, faded ink and hand-drawn schematics. The paper crackled slightly, a sound that, to my ears, sounded like the whispering of future profit. I held it up, tilting it so the weak afternoon light hit the central stamp and the formal, heavy calligraphy at the top. "You're right, Mark," I conceded, my voice low and serious. "The house, as it stands, is worthless, a true liability. If I were fixing it up just to be a regular 3-bedroom rental, I'd be insane. But I'm not." I pointed to a specific section on the schematic, a small, detailed inset of the roofline and the upper structural supports, which looked unusually complex for a simple 1920s cottage. "You see this? I traced the line with my finger. This detail, the specific pitch, the lumber types, the construction method, this isn't 1920s Vermont craftsmanship. This is something else entirely, something much, much older. And that's what this document confirms. I gently pushed the entire document into his hands. His expression shifted instantly from mockery to confusion, then to outright bewilderment as he squinted at the formal header. The official seal, though faded, was unmistakable. The Preservation Society of New England. And the date wasn't a modern appraisal date. It was a formal valuation from 1957. Mark frowned, trying to make sense of the heavy technical jargon used throughout the text. Words like post-medieval truss system, original hand-forged joinery, and significant colonial-era architectural overlap. What? What is this? He stammered, the confidence completely gone from his tone. A Preservation Society report from 50 years ago? Why does this even matter? They obviously abandoned it too if the house looks like this. Look closer at the findings, I instructed, keeping my gaze steady. Specifically Section 3, the Historic Valuation Plan. I took the document back and pointed to the section he had missed, the crux of my entire gamble. The document stated, in cold, factual terms, that the current 1920s structure was built around and incorporating a far older, separate structure. A structure they dated not to the 1920s, but to the late 17th century, a period when this area was little more than untouched wilderness. This wasn't a standard old house. It was a historical shell game. The decaying 1920s façade was essentially camouflage, protecting a hidden, untouched piece of colonial American architecture inside. The original, historic core had survived, largely shielded from the elements by the newer addition. They believe the entire front block is built around a preserved, early colonial log structure, one of the few remaining examples of a specific, rare Dutch timber framing technique in New England, I explained, letting the weight of the discovery sink in. If this valuation is accurate, and if the original structure is still intact under all this plaster and cheap siding, then we're not just talking about restoring an old house. We're talking about uncovering a piece of protected American history. A piece of history that, according to the final valuation number at the bottom of the page, carries an appraised value, if fully preserved and authenticated, that is astronomically higher than anything you or I could ever imagine. The house is worthless, Mark, but the core building? That is priceless. I gave him another look, a calm, expectant gaze that asked if he finally understood the true scale of the risk and the reward. The old house wasn't an expense. It was a Trojan horse, and the project had just changed from a simple renovation to an archaeological excavation. We were going to peel back the layers of the 20th century to find the truth hidden beneath. Mark stood there, holding the brittle paper like it was a live grenade. The silence stretched, thick and dusty, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow. He didn't laugh this time. He just kept running his finger over the date, 1957. The Preservation Society of New England doesn't just hand out appraisals like this for a casual flip, Luke, he finally whispered, his voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning excitement. If this is real, and if that structure is actually inside here, he trailed off, suddenly seeing past the peeling wallpaper and the mold to the impossible history buried within. His eyes narrowed. But why did they leave it? Why did the Thorne family cover it up and forget about it? That's the real question. A structure this old, using a rare Dutch framing technique? That's not something you just turn into a shed. That's the risk, isn't it? I countered, retrieving the document and carefully sliding it back into the protective folder. The valuation is based on the assumption that the colonial structure is intact. Our job now is to find out if it is and what condition it's in. We're not renovating, Mark. We're performing surgery on an architectural ghost. Mark, despite his skepticism, was also a man who understood the language of money, and the valuation figure, a number with far too many zeros for a house on Ash Street, had silenced his critical voice. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he certainly believed in historical provenance and the deep pockets of wealthy collectors. The next few weeks were brutal. We began the systematic deconstruction, focusing initially on the small central section where the 1957 report suggested the original core was most robust. Tearing down the 20th century was messy, discouraging work. We started by stripping the walls. The plaster, a thick, gritty nightmare of horsehair and calcified dust, came down in heavy, choking clouds, followed by the thin, fragile lath boards. Every swing of the sledgehammer felt like a step backward. The dust settled on everything, coating my hair, my lungs, and my determination. Mark was still a constant source of cynical commentary. He'd stand back, wiping sweat from his brow, and look at the growing mound of debris. "Congratulations, Luke. You've successfully turned a dilapidated house into a professional landfill. This is going to cost us an extra 10 grand just for disposal." The real difficulty wasn't the labor, though. It was the demoralizing lack of payoff. The deeper we dug, the more complicated the cover-up seemed. We found not one, but 2 layers of electrical wiring, one dating to the 1950s and another haphazardly installed in the 1980s. The plumbing was a spiderweb of corroded copper and iron pipes that had been routed directly through where the Preservation Society schematics indicated the colonial timbers should be. Whoever built the 1920s shell and whoever performed the subsequent repairs had no respect for, or perhaps no knowledge of, the ancient secret lurking inside. With every pipe we carefully cut and every wire we gingerly clipped, my internal voice of doubt grew louder. Had the 1957 team been wrong? Had the Thorne family ultimately just destroyed the very history they were supposedly covering up? Then came the first serious setback, the kind of moment that makes you seriously consider quitting. In what the schematics labeled the original hearth area, we found severe water damage that had gone undetected for decades. A leaky roof segment directly above had caused extensive rot in what we hoped were supporting joists. The wood was spongy, dark, and alive with insects. It wasn't the colonial core, but it was dangerously close. Mark pointed to the damage, his face grim. "If the rot has spread to the main structural supports that are holding up the colonial section, you might as well call in the bulldozers right now. Historic value or not, no one can save a rotten core." The sheer scale of the potential damage, the possibility that I had poured everything into a magnificent historical lie, nearly broke my resolve. I spent a whole day just sitting on a bucket in the dust, staring at the decay, the smell of damp old wood, a heavy blanket of failure. But I was committed. I had to know for sure. I focused on a small, recessed area in the center of the wall, exactly where the 1957 report indicated the corner post of the original structure should meet the foundation. This section was covered by a final, thick layer of drywall from a 1980s Reno. I took a utility knife and cut a small, neat square, then gently began prying the drywall away. It didn't peel. It fought back, adhered to something incredibly hard beneath. I switched to a chisel and hammered gently, trying to preserve whatever was behind it. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound was different here, solid and deep, not the hollow echo of modern framing. With a final, desperate heave, the last piece of drywall splintered and fell. And there it was, not lath and plaster, not modern dimensional lumber. Staring back at me was a piece of wood so utterly unlike everything else in the house that it took my breath away. It was a massive, dark timber, hand-hewn, scarred, and blackened with age, probably from fire or deep oxidation. It wasn't square or uniform. The surface bore the distinctive wavy marks of a broad axe, the unmistakable signature of wood worked before the era of mass production. This wasn't pine or fir. It was heavy oak, dense and enduring. It was a corner post, and it was perfectly intact. Mark, who had been leaning against a pile of scrap, slowly straightened up, his mouth slightly ajar. "Luke, what is that?" he whispered, walking over and reaching out a hesitant hand to touch the ancient wood. The color was a deep, rich sepia, and the texture was rough, almost petrified. "It's the corner of the original house, Mark," I breathed, feeling a huge wave of relief and electric excitement wash over me, chasing away weeks of doubt. That wood is over 300 years old. The society was right. It survived. The post was joined to a thick horizontal beam using a massive interlocking joint, a mortise and tenon secured not with factory-made nails, but with a series of wooden pegs or trunnels. The craftsmanship was stunningly rudimentary, yet incredibly strong, a testament to pure colonial ingenuity. This was the moment of validation, the point of no return. We had found the treasure. But as I ran my hand along the rough lower section of the post, clearing away the dust and crumbled plaster, my fingers brushed against something metallic. It wasn't part of the joint. It was recessed into the wood itself, hidden just beneath where the 1980s drywall had been tacked. It was small, no bigger than a matchbox, secured by what looked like an old, oxidized brass latch. A tiny, almost invisible seam in the ancient oak suggested a compartment. I glanced at Mark, whose focus was entirely on the magnificent timber. I pulled my hand back, a sudden cold rush of adrenaline hitting me. Elias Thorne, the old owner who had supposedly kept something locked in the basement. What if he had also left something here, not in the structure, but in it? The Historic Valuation Plan was just the map to the real secret. And the real secret, whatever it was waiting for me, locked deep inside the heart of this ancient, whispering wood. This project had just gone from an architectural puzzle to a historical lockbox. Mark's initial awe at the colonial timber quickly morphed into acute focus when he saw the brass latch. The magnificent 300-year-old oak post was no longer just a museum piece. It was a safe deposit box. The transformation in Mark was instantaneous. The skeptic was replaced by the treasure hunter. He leaned in, his breath fogging the ancient wood. "You've got to be kidding me, Luke. A secret compartment? In the actual structure? This house isn't just old, it's active." "Stay back," I instructed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The adrenaline from confirming the colonial structure was nothing compared to this nervous energy. The Historic Valuation Plan was the key to the architectural secret, but this small metallic latch promised the key to the human secret, the reason someone went to such lengths to hide something inside a structural beam. The latch was tiny, severely oxidized and stiff with age, fused to the wood by decades of moisture and dust. I carefully applied a drop of penetrating oil, waited 5 minutes, which felt like 5 hours, and then used the tip of a precision screwdriver to gently try and engage the mechanism. There was a terrible, resisting groan of metal against metal, and then, with a soft, almost polite click, the latch sprang open. The seam around the small rectangle of wood was nearly invisible. But now that the latch was released, I could see where it had been meticulously carved to blend into the grain. I used the screwdriver as a lever and slowly, agonizingly, pried the panel outward. The wood scraped against itself, protesting the violation of its long-held secret. The compartment was roughly 6 inches deep and surprisingly clean inside, lined with what looked like sun-faded burgundy velvet, now mostly disintegrated into a fine powder. Resting on this dusty royal background were 3 objects. The first was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages thick and yellowed, secured shut with a narrow leather strap. The second was a heavy, ornate key. Not a standard house key, but an old skeleton key with an intricate, almost crown-like head, wrapped tightly in a piece of frayed, pale blue silk. The third item, tucked beneath the journal, was a small, folded piece of parchment that looked suspiciously like a crude map or a series of drawn symbols. Mark gasped, completely losing his composure. "A diary, a key, a map. Luke, we are officially in a movie." I carefully lifted the journal first. The leather was dry and cracked, smelling faintly of pipe smoke and damp paper. The cover was blank, but when I opened it, the handwriting inside was formal, slanting, and clearly done with a fountain pen. It was a man's hand, and the opening date was stark, July 14th, 1957. This was the same year as the Preservation Society's valuation. This wasn't some colonial-era document. This was the journal of the last man who truly understood what was hidden in the house, Elias Thorne. I flipped to the first page. I skipped the pleasantries and found the first, truly captivating entry. It read, "The assessment is complete. They know what it is. They documented its age and its construction. But they do not, thank God, know what I have done with the space within. They think it's just timber. Let them catalog the wood. It's the silence that matters. I have reinforced the cover-up. The 1920s façade will hold, and the truth will remain buried, safe from the hands that seek it. The key is now wrapped and put away. They will never think to look for the lock where the air is the thickest. I stopped reading aloud, my voice suddenly dry. The tension in the room had become almost physical. The air is the thickest? Mark repeated, his brow furrowed in concentration. What does that even mean? Where the air is thick? It means Elias Thorne knew exactly what he was doing, I said, turning the ornate key over in my hand. It was cold and heavier than it looked. He hired the Preservation Society to document the historic core, not to save it, but to create a legal paper trail, the Historic Valuation Plan that would make the house untouchable without drawing attention to his own secret. He used the house's legitimate history as a shield for something personal he was hiding. Something he feared the hands that seek it would find. I quickly examined the third item, the folded parchment. It wasn't a map of the house, but a detailed sketch of the cellar, drawn from memory, with precise measurements. In the center of the sketch, where the floor plan of the house would sit, was a bold, X-marked circle, labeled in the same slanting hand, the place where I must wait. Crucially, near the sketched location, there was a small note scrawled in the margin. The air is the thickest where the soil is untouched, Luke. I looked up at Mark. He addressed me, or someone with my name. The journal was dated 1957. I was born decades after that. This wasn't a note for me. It was a note for an original Luke, or maybe a strange, unnerving coincidence. The tension was now laced with personal implication. Wait, Mark said, pointing to the key. You said Elias Thorne kept something locked in the basement. Everyone knew that rumor. Maybe the thickest air refers to a space sealed off from ventilation, a place where the air has grown stagnant and heavy, like a completely closed-off room underground. And this key, this must be the lock. The realization hit us simultaneously. The Historic Valuation Plan was my architectural lottery ticket. But Elias Thorne's hidden compartment held the real secret, a personal drama tied to the house, protected by its very age. We had spent weeks digging through plaster and wood. Now, the real hunt began. I carefully secured the journal and the parchment, leaving only the heavy skeleton key in my hand. The basement, I declared, looking toward the dark, narrow door leading down to the house's dank underbelly. We're not waiting. He left this for someone, maybe for himself to retrieve, maybe for someone else to find later. Whatever he hid down there, whatever makes the air thick, is what he was protecting. The house just became a time capsule of fear. The ancient structure was now actively pulling us deeper into its secrets, leading us away from historic preservation and toward a far more compelling and potentially dangerous mystery. It was time to descend into the cold, silent dark and face what Elias Thorne had locked away and guarded with a century of neglect. We had the key, and the thickest air was waiting. The air in the basement was indeed thick, a heavy, cold cocktail of wet earth, mildew, and stale silence. It clung to the back of our throats, tasting metallic and deep. We descended the narrow, rickety wooden steps slowly, our headlamps carving out small, bobbing circles of light in the overwhelming darkness. The basement was nothing like the relatively modern, though decayed, upper floors. This was the house's bedrock, its true foundation. The walls were rough-hewn stone, clearly original to the 17th century core, cemented with thick mortar. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and damp, smelling profoundly of the ground itself. Mark, despite his initial bravado, stayed close behind me. "The air is thick, all right?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, amplified unnervingly by the enclosed space. It's like breathing a 50-year-old coffin. We followed the rough sketch Elias Thorne had left on the parchment. It indicated the location near the center of the structure, away from the exterior walls and the chimney flue, a space perfectly protected from external disturbances. We navigated around towering stacks of empty canning jars, rusted tools, and what looked like the brittle remains of old coal bins. The basement was a dumping ground for decades of accumulated refuse, a graveyard of forgotten utility. Finally, we reached the spot. Tucked behind a crumbling wall of hastily stacked firewood from what must have been the 1960s, we found it, a section of the stone wall that looked noticeably different. It wasn't a seamless part of the foundation. It was a single massive slate slab, perhaps 4 feet tall and 2 wide, set into the larger wall structure. The edges were sealed with fresh, or at least newer mortar, clearly indicating it had been intentionally placed there. This was the spot on Thorne's sketch marked with the X. My hands trembled as I cleared away the last of the debris. In the lower left corner of the slate slab, almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark stone, was a heavy, oxidized iron escutcheon plate, a lock mechanism designed for a serious bolt. The plate was circular and ancient-looking, but the cylinder where the key went looked functional, if stiff. I held up the ornate skeleton key from the compartment. It was designed for this. The tension was almost unbearable. This wasn't about colonial architecture anymore. This was about breaking into a man's final, guarded confession. I carefully inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, fitting the grooves with a gratifying precision that spoke volumes about the lock's quality and the key's age. I grasped the head of the key and slowly, deliberately, turned it clockwise. It was stiff, requiring all my strength, and then, with a loud, resounding clunk that echoed through the stone chamber and made Mark jump, the bolt retracted. I grabbed the thick iron ring set into the stone and pulled. The suction was intense, but the slate slab finally scraped heavily across the foundation floor, revealing a dark, square aperture behind it. The thick air had found its source. A small, sealed room, completely protected from the dampness of the main basement, lay open before us. We swung our headlamps into the vault. It was small, no bigger than a large closet, lined with concrete blocks and sealed with a heavy tar application that must have been the source of the stagnant air. The contents were shockingly sparse and organized. In the center, on a small, rickety wooden table, sat a single, hermetically sealed metal box, the kind used for storing film negatives or sensitive documents. Next to the box was a single, old-fashioned, high-powered shortwave radio, completely disassembled and neatly packaged in a crate of excelsior. I went straight for the metal box. It wasn't locked. I flipped the latch and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dry cotton cloth, were 2 main items. The first was a small, sealed envelope labeled in Thorne's distinct, slanting hand. For the authorities, only in the event of my disappearance. The second item was a thick, brown paper folder labeled simply, "The Trust and the Exchange." I carefully lifted the folder. Inside were dozens of pages of old legal documents, stock certificates from companies that no longer existed, and bank statements from the late 1940s and 1950s. It wasn't gold, but it was far more dangerous. A meticulous paper trail of a massive, coordinated movement of wealth. It pointed to a financial trust established in 1947, designed to vanish completely upon the death of a specific beneficiary. The documents outlined a complex offshore transfer of assets tied to the sale of an extremely valuable and historically sensitive collection of artifacts. The name of the collection was redacted in most places, but one unredacted line, buried deep in a subsidiary document, hit me like a physical blow. The Gilded Compass Collection. I looked up at Mark, my head spinning. This isn't about local history, Mark. This is national, maybe international. Elias Thorne was protecting a collection, or the money from it, tied to a secret trust. And the papers suggest that someone was trying to seize those assets violently around the time this house was valued in 1957. I then saw the third piece of the puzzle, tucked into the spine of the folder, a small black and white photograph. It was a picture of a young woman, strikingly beautiful, with a serene but haunting look in her eyes. Her image was pristine, completely untouched by the dampness of the basement. Taped to the back of the photo was a single sentence, written in a different, more delicate hand than Thorne's. They will follow the collection, but they will never find the beneficiary unless they know the Song of the Stars. The complexity had just multiplied exponentially. We had confirmation of a serious, decades-old financial secret, the implied threat of powerful people chasing it, and now a mysterious young woman and a cryptic clue, the Song of the Stars. Just as I was about to open the sealed envelope, a loud, unmistakable creak of a floorboard sounded directly above us in the kitchen. It wasn't the settling of an old house. It was heavy, deliberate. Someone was upstairs. Someone had followed us, or worse, was already waiting for us to find the vault. We weren't just investigating a ghost story anymore. We were caught in a live wire, and the hands that seek it were standing right over our heads. We were trapped in Thorne's vault, and the time for reading was over. The creak was not the house settling. It was the definitive sound of someone who knew exactly where they were and what they were looking for. It came from the kitchen floor, directly above the central foundation, which meant the intruder was standing right over Thorne's old colonial core. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be a squirrel or a stray animal. Mark and I froze, crouched low in the small, damp confines of the vault, the air suddenly thick not just with stale decay, but with raw terror. My hand instinctively clutched the heavy, sealed envelope labeled "For the authorities" and the folder of stock certificates. We had just stumbled upon a secret worth millions, tied to a dangerous, decades-old conflict. And within 30 seconds, the hunter had arrived. I flicked off my headlamp, plunging the vault into absolute darkness. Mark did the same. The silence that followed was terrifying. We were listening to the house breathe, waiting for the next sign of our pursuer. "Do you think they saw the lights?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking, an inch from my ear. "Doesn't matter now," I hissed back. They heard the lock. That heavy clunk echoed all through the foundation. They know we found it. We could hear faint, shuffling movements above, then the distinct sound of the kitchen door being forced or kicked open. The intruder was inside and moving fast. We couldn't retreat through the main basement. The rickety stairs led right to the entrance they had just breached. We were trapped. I ran my hands along the interior concrete wall of the vault, desperately searching for anything the schematics might have indicated, any detail Thorne might have left behind. My fingers brushed against the rough surface near the floor, and I felt a faint, almost invisible seam. It wasn't the concrete block. It was an access point. Thorne, the meticulous hider, wouldn't have relied on a single exit. He would have known that the lock, no matter how strong, could be found. "Help me here," I murmured, guiding Mark's hand to the seam. It was a section of the floor, about 2 feet by 2 feet, near the foundation stone, perfectly aligned with the colonial timber that formed the vault ceiling. It looked like an old, embedded drain cover, but it was too sturdy. We pulled together, and the square section of concrete and dirt floor, sealed with a rubber gasket, groaned and slowly lifted, revealing a narrow, vertical shaft leading down into the darkness. A dry well, or perhaps a disused cistern, clearly modified into a narrow escape route. It was claustrophobic, dirty, and horrifyingly small, but it was the only way out. "You first," I urged Mark, pushing him toward the hole. "Take the envelope. If we split up, they only find half the truth." Mark, driven by pure instinct now, didn't argue. He slid into the hole feet first, the heavy soil dusting his clothes as he disappeared. I heard a grunt, then a muffled, "Go, go," from below. I quickly gathered the metal box containing the financial documents, the journal, and the photo of the young woman. As I was about to drop into the shaft, I heard the sound I dreaded, the heavy, rhythmic scraping of the main basement door being forced open. The intruder was coming down. I slid into the hole just as the beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the main basement and hit the opening of the vault. I heard a grunt of frustration, followed by the heavy thud of a boot hitting the ground. The person was tall, powerful, and now realizing we were gone. I dropped the remaining few feet into the shaft, landing hard beside Mark in the damp earth. "Move," I whispered, scrambling forward. The shaft was horizontal now, just wide enough for us to crawl on our stomachs. It smelled purely of old earth and roots. We moved frantically, pushing past thick, embedded roots and scraping our shoulders against the rough walls. Above us, we could hear the footsteps and muffled curses of the intruder as they entered the vault and quickly realized the small escape hatch. After what felt like an eternity of agonizing, dirt-choked crawling, the tunnel opened slightly. We were in a small, square stone room, a forgotten root cellar attached to the foundation, but completely separated from the house's interior. Above our heads was a heavy wooden hatch, sealed from the outside. I stood, brushing the dirt from my face. My headlamp was dead, but a faint, ethereal moonlight was seeping in through a loose floorboard above the hatch. Mark pointed to the old wooden planks of the hatch itself. Scratched deeply into the wood, illuminated by the silver moonlight, was a complex, repeating pattern of small, deliberate carvings. They weren't random marks. They looked like a stylized grouping of 7 distinct dots, repeated in a spiral formation. "The Song of the Stars," I breathed, realizing the connection. The cryptic note attached to the photo, the mysterious clue given by the young woman. It wasn't a musical key, it was a physical marker. This was the sign that confirmed the root cellar was the intended secondary exit, the place where the beneficiary was supposed to wait. Using a rusty trowel I found on a shelf, we managed to pry the heavy hatch open. It led straight out into the overgrown, neglected backyard, miles away from the main road and shrouded by the dense, skeletal branches of late autumn trees. We scrambled out, bursting into the cold night air, gulping down huge lungfuls of clean, sharp oxygen. We were free of the house, but we were not safe. The truth was now external. The house had given up its secret, and now we held it in our hands. The journal, the financial trust, and the photograph of the woman linked to the Gilded Compass collection. We were no longer house flippers. We were unwilling couriers of a secret that powerful, dangerous people were still actively seeking, even after 50 years. As we slipped into the dark tree line, the lights of a strange, dark sedan pulled silently up the long, deserted driveway leading to 1428 Ash Street, confirming that the person chasing us was far more professional and far more lethal than my cousin Mark had ever imagined. The game had just left the board, and we were running for our lives, carrying the final, crucial piece of Elias Thorne's hidden life. We plunged deep into the protective curtain of the woods behind the house, scrambling over fallen logs and through thick underbrush. The adrenaline was a searing pain in my lungs, but the fear, the cold, hard fear of being hunted, was a better motivator than any exhaustion. Behind us, through the sparse trees, we could see the distant, methodical sweep of the flashlight beam from the dark sedan, confirming that the intruder wasn't just checking the house. They were sweeping the perimeter. We ran until the sound of our own ragged breathing drowned out the distant sounds of our pursuer. When we finally collapsed, gasping near a dry creek bed half a mile away, we were caked in mud, dirt, and the bitter knowledge that we were carrying a secret that people were willing to kill for. Mark immediately pulled out the sealed envelope, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. "The authorities," he choked out. "Thorne left this for the authorities. We need to know what's inside. If we call the police, we need to know what kind of danger we're putting ourselves in." Using a shaky utility knife, I broke the fragile, dried wax seal. Inside, tucked beneath a formal letter detailing the financial trust, was a single, folded piece of paper, Thorne's final coded message. It was a grid of numbers and letters, beneath which was written, "The Song of the Stars is the only key to the beneficiary's lock. They will follow the money. Find the 7 dots and trust the alignment." "The 7 dots!" Mark exclaimed, instantly making the connection. The markings on the root cellar hatch, they weren't random, that was the cipher key. I pulled out the photograph of the beautiful young woman, studying the writing on the back. They will follow the collection, but they will never find the beneficiary unless they know the Song of the Stars. We needed light and a clear head. We found a small, abandoned hunting shack further into the woods, covered in thick ivy. We barricaded the door with an old crate, and using the dim screen of my phone as a light source, we began to work. The cipher was a substitution table. Using the number of stars in the Big Dipper, 7, as our initial key, we applied the 7-letter shift to the numerical grid Thorne had left. It took us an agonizing 30 minutes, but the message slowly revealed itself. It wasn't an address, but a set of celestial coordinates and a specific time. Look to the zenith on December 21, 1958 at 3 a.m. The compass points to the oldest oak by the Willow Creek in Freeport. The address is 17 Willowbrook Lane. Thorne hadn't hidden the beneficiary from the world. He had hidden them in plain sight, with the address disguised by a temporal and celestial clue. We were now operating 50 years too late, but the address was real. I used my phone to quickly look up 17 Willowbrook Lane, Freeport. An image popped up, a small, unassuming seaside bungalow. I cross-referenced the property owner. The name listed was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Vance, I whispered. The beneficiary, the young woman in the photograph. Thorne wasn't hiding money. He was hiding a person, someone connected to the Gilded Compass collection. We knew what we had to do. We couldn't call the authorities. They wouldn't believe our story of colonial timbers, hidden vaults, and celestial ciphers until it was too late. We had to get to Eleanor Vance first. The following dawn was a blur of hitchhiking, a frantic train ride, and finally, a rented car paid for with the last of my emergency cash. We arrived at Willowbrook Lane late that afternoon. The bungalow was quiet, nestled beneath a huge ancient oak tree that certainly looked like the oldest in the area. I knocked on the door. It opened slowly, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair, her face lined with the weight of years, but her eyes, the exact, serene, slightly haunting eyes from the 1957 photograph, were unmistakable. It was Eleanor Vance. "Mrs. Vance?" I asked gently, holding out the black and white photograph. She looked at the photo, then at me, then at the frantic expression on my face. She didn't look confused. She looked resigned, as if she had been expecting this day for 50 years. "You found Elias's lockbox," she stated softly. "I always wondered who would find it." We spent the next 4 hours in that quiet bungalow, poring over the documents, finally opening Thorne's sealed envelope, which contained a formal, undeniable accusation against a powerful, shadowy organization that had attempted to seize the Gilded Compass collection, a priceless cache of early American navigational tools, by force. Thorne, her father, had not died of natural causes. He had faked his death and gone into hiding, establishing the trust to ensure Eleanor's safety while using the abandoned house as a decoy and a time capsule for the financial trail. The house, built around the colonial core, was the perfect shield. He had trusted that the Historic Valuation Plan would keep the house protected, inadvertently protecting his secret. The true resolution was not in finding gold, but in finding the truth and the beneficiary. We immediately contacted a specialized legal firm using the contact information Thorne left in the envelope, transferring the full custody of the trust to Eleanor Vance and setting the legal machinery in motion to expose the truth. As Mark and I finally sat in a cheap motel room hundreds of miles away, watching the news report about the investigation surrounding an unusual architectural discovery at 1428 Ash Street, I felt the monumental weight of the past finally lift. We had fulfilled Elias Thorne's decades-old mission. The old house, which everyone saw as a worthless liability, turned out to be the most valuable asset in a multi-million-dollar inheritance, a keeper of American history, and a sanctuary for a fugitive. The Historic Valuation Plan didn't just give me architectural value, it gave me an entry point into a life of purpose, danger, and undeniable history. My initial smile to Mark, showing him the valuation plan, had been smug. Now, it was a look of tired, profound realization. We were no longer just investors. We were witnesses. We were carrying the weight of a secret that had changed the trajectory of our lives forever. We survived the abandoned house, but the chase, we knew, was only just beginning.